We come to the 9th presentation, and the Parayana is emphasized again a refinement on many counts. One of them is a refinement of what we have developed the last several years, and that is that civilization has a complex of 3 time forms that overlay and penetrate through the dimension of time in the universe, which means then that it also penetrates space-time. And while the universe is phenomenally integraled by space-time, the 3 time forms of civilization allow for a transcendent quality to come into play that was only there fleetingly and not really understood in terms of cultures. Culture is always comfortable when its cycles fold into nature's cycles, so that however the seasons are where a culture will be, that's the ritual cycle, and it goes on year after year, much in the same form, which gives tradition a stability. In between nature and culture, then, is the ritual base of what we do and what we use, what we do with it, the things and the actions arranged into a circularity, a cycle of a base. And that cycle of the base forms literally the substrate by which the experience of the natural, cultural, ritual year proceeds and has its effects. In the medieval period, which lasted roughly from about the late 300s AD until the beginnings of the 1100s, and then it was the high medieval period until the Renaissance in the late 1400s. So for about 1200 years, more or less, a medieval period countenanced 2 seasons. One a season of summer and one a season of winter, with in-betweens. But eventually, in the 1100s, in the high Middle Ages, a new season came into play that was not really emphasized in the earlier 800 years. And that festival, that ritual occasion, was Pentecost. And Pentecost was seen as the celebration, the ritual commemoration of a jubilee after the crucifixion, resurrection. And that 50th day, Pentecost, was the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the gathered community, and they were able to, as the phrase goes and is still popular, they were able to speak in tongues. They were able to speak any language, and many languages that could not be understood, so that the universal scalar of all languages became suddenly, Pentecostally, descended upon them. And this descent was the descent of the Holy Ghost. And so the Holy Ghost became the teacher of all languages. And so the festival of Pentecost became increasingly, during the later 1100s, the season in which all Arthurian tales were founded and told. That it wasn't the natural season of summer or of winter, not in the natural cycle, but in an intrusion from the supernatural, from the realm, the dimensions of the Holy Ghost coming down and the Holy Spirit conferring upon the community of the elect the ability then to be able to converse in all languages, even in tongues that were not known at the time, but presumably could be known, or those that once were known and were forgotten. The important point is that Pentecost was the beginning of a transcendental dimension of language, a spirit-directed capacity for mankind to have this phenomenal new dimension into play. What came out of the Arthurian tales and stories, poems, and so forth, were given a new visionary dimension. And that visionary dimension actually acted de facto as a fifth dimension to the dimensions of space and time. And so a consciousness able to enter into a fifth business of visioning, one then could exercise the ability for a language, any language, to have a transcendental, dimensional quality, and the characters in that story to be not limited by natural time or by natural space, but was given over to a dimension of what, when it concerned animals or children, were fairy tales in the medieval earlier period, now became applied to a realm of fairy in the high medieval realm. And this eventually, when that higher medieval matured to have a threshold very near where the Renaissance had taken it into a new history, into a new cosmology. The new history of the Renaissance was remembering what the classical apex of civilization had really been. Not at all the medieval period, but something that the medieval period had lost, had forgotten, had not taken the time to learn, had not sufficiently investigated. And it was pointed out as soon as the ability to find original texts, original books from the classical realm that were not subject to the scrambling of ordinary medieval mythology. The fairy land became something of a glorious past that then, in vision, could give a glorious future. And so the Renaissance was a rediscovery of the classic actuality, and from that also the promise of a renewed, greater classical era to come. When we look at the way in which the Renaissance and the High Medieval came together, at last, the very tail end of what was the Renaissance of Italy, going into France, eventually even going into Germany, Northern Europe. But the last bit of the Renaissance came to England. And so you find almost contemporaneously someone like Sir Edmund Spenser writing The Faerie Queen, a great epic about Elizabeth and her era as being a fairy vision of especially the protagonist, the Red Cross Knight. And of course the Red Cross is the St. Andrew's cross, the four wings of the cross being equal, and that was the symbol of the Knights Templar. And right away, one has in Spenser, in the high medieval, a sense that something immense is taking place, that the Red Cross Knight is exploring this fairy queen realm to go back and deepen what was, yes, the Renaissance had rediscovered some things, but Spenser showed it had not recovered accurately what lay beneath and deeper than the classical realm at its apex was the classical realm at its agrarian beginnings. And so with that caution, one comes to understand that one of the earliest works of Edmund Spenser was called The Shepherd's Calendar, the cycle of what watchers of flocks would do, of what the farming of edibles and so forth would do, husbandry and agriculture, and also the culture where the shepherds watching their flocks by night had witnessed something extraordinary, had witnessed a birth of such titanic dimensions that when that figure matured, turned out to be the Savior of the world. That it is a quality especially that seeps into the high medieval tail end of the Renaissance England, and that is to begin to understand that what has happened here in just a couple of lifetimes is that the medieval form of dramatic action, the miracle plays, like the York mystery play cycle, or there's a couple of others that are famous, the York, the most famous. That was the high medieval period leading up to its merger from the high medieval into the very late Renaissance, making the theater then something that was the logical future from those miracle plays into the development of theaters at the very center, not of the culture, but of the Renaissance culture of England, which was London, which was exactly focused on the banks of the Thames, not far on one side of the Thames from the great edifice of St. Paul's early cathedral position, because the phrase, the shepherds watched their flocks by night upon a midnight clear when the babe was born in Bethlehem in the manger, comes from the Gospel according to Luke. And Luke is always paired, always twinned with St. Paul. You do not find the shepherds watching their flocks, noticing that the angels are singing on high because of the birth. In Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, it is the three wise men who come from the east, bearing three gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, the rare, valuable metal and incense items, which in small quantities were worth a great deal of money. And bringing those three gifts, the three magi actually were providing a necessary financing of the necessary fleeing into an exile from a certain death of the newborn child by King Herod, always remembered as the Massacre of the Innocents. All babies 2 and under male were killed at one panic period when the three wise men came into play and initially went to the court of King Herod, saying that they had come from afar. In fact, they came from ancient Iran. And the three cities in Iran were well known by 1905, when a scholar named Jackson Williams, A.V. Jackson Williams, in 1905 wrote an article on the three cities in Iran, and Jackson Williams was an expert on Iran, on Magi, on all those things, and actually had been to those villages himself, which has since been not played up and forgotten, because one does not like to stress the fact that three Zoroastrians had come by celestial navigation and by visionary time and by tremendous prismatic personal triad to exactly the right place at the right time for something that was honored in the Zoroastrian tradition as well as in the Jewish, not so much the Jewish even, but the Semitic tradition, that the way in which the Aryan Iranians and the Semitic Hellenistic Jews were paired and twinned together, tuned together at that birth, at that earliest stage of recognition, before anyone else recognized other than Joseph and Mary themselves. It was the three wise men that came and confirmed this was the event. This is the babe. This is the marking of a new time form. It was 9 BC. All of this had been scrambled so that by the time of the high medieval, when one had the Fairy Queen epic being written, and it was so immense that it was not finished by Spencer by the time that he passed on. Just begun book 8 of it. It's an immense tome, wonderful to read, ballooning up to immense proportions from the Shepherd's Calendar and a few other writings of his. But contemporaneous with Spencer, his closest friend, Sir Philip Sidney, had begun translating the Psalms of David, because it was a visionary thing that something very close to that event 2,000 years before had had a tremendous event in a millennium 1,000 years later. And by very sharp thinking, very deep learning, this group of people who were able to read Hebrew and Greek and Latin, as well as English and French and Italian, mostly, sometimes German, they understood that 1,000 years before 1000 BC, there had been a great surge of two aspects that were tuned together, just like Zarathustra, like Zoroaster was tuned to others of his time. The revival, the renaissance of Zoroaster, of Zarathustra as Zoroaster, was about 500 BC. Cyrus the Great and his Achaemenid dynasty. But paired with that was the incredible visioning of Ezekiel in the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. He has this revisioning not of the Torah, but of a new dimension to the Torah. And along with Ezekiel being there in the Babylon that was now a part of Cyrus the Great's Iranian Empire, the Iranians also had control of Egypt, so that some masterful figure named Pythagoras, who had studied with the Heliopolitan priests in Egypt for 22 years, was invited to come to Iran and study Zoroaster for another 11 years. And so you had all at the same time the Zoroastrian revival, the beginnings of the Greek revival with Pythagoras, the beginnings of the Renaissance of Judaism, not just of Judaism, but of the entire Hebrew scalar of civilization with Ezekiel. And you had this confluence at the same time then as Spencer was writing The Faerie Queene, Sir Philip Sidney was translating the Psalms of David, and Sir George Sandys was translating the great Metamorphoses of Ovid, and editions of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey especially, were being prepared. And so you had all of a sudden the Renaissance reaching England right at the same time as the development of a sense of 1,000 years BC and 1,000 years AD, and that somehow these millennia showcased the event of 2,000 years. At that time, it was 1,500 years. And they understood that 1,500 years was 3 times 500, and that the 500-year cycle then was understood because they could read for the first time. They could read the original editions again of Tacitus, who mentions the cycle of the phoenix, and that the cycle of the phoenix fell in 39, what became 36 AD, when you transpose the dates in Tacitus. And one understands that 500 years before that is 536 BC, which is about the time of Cyrus the Great, of Ezekiel, of Zoroaster, and of many other things like the Buddha, like Lao Tzu, happening all at the same time in the world. And that also then was a renaissance 2,000 years before the 1500 AD Renaissance, and all of a sudden everyone was understanding that time forms in civilization are more powerful than natural time, that the spaces of a conscious dimensional mankind is not limited by the dimensions of natural space, nor natural time. And that by this way, a whole new vista opened exactly at the time that the New World was discovered. So that one began to understand that from Columbus to the Elizabethan companies, that were going to establish not only going to the New World like the Spanish had gone to just go after gold, they were going after a transcendental spiritual gold, after the golden quality of mankind personified, symbolized by El Dorado, the great masterful king, the magical king of the New World, who owned all of the gold mines. One didn't have to go and find the gold willy-nilly. One could go and find the golden man. And the one leading that expedition again and again was Sir Walter Raleigh, a good friend not only of Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser, but also a friend of William Shakespeare. So that one has to begin to understand that when you're dealing with our time, when you're dealing with the 21st century, the 2000s AD, one is dealing with a potent new time form that the best word for it that I could find is from physics. It's a carrier wave. And a carrier wave always has an undertone, like a tone and then an undertone. And that undertone is the reference wave that gives the calibration of what the meaning of the carrier wave is going to emphasize and turn out. Like in music, an undertone will be there. And like in music as well, there's always then an overtone. And that overtone is where the lyric play of music begins to have its way. And one of the best ways to understand it, an idea of genius that was first mooted by Louis de Broglie in 1926 for the 1927 Solvay conference in Belgium, that this is a pilot wave taken from the experience in England of some mathematician watching from a horse one of the great long canals in Britain, that sometimes a wave was set in motion that would not diminish as it went down through the whole canal. And out of this came the mathematical idea of the soliton. A wave whose integral quality is heightened by a differential dimension of exceeding the natural innervation by nature in space and time. It doesn't diminish in the soliton. And that there are pilot waves in theoretical vision that are people who do not diminish their visionary capacities. And de Broglie was there in 1927 when you had people like Einstein and Marie Curie, Heinrich Lorentz, etc., a whole room full of geniuses who were free to work not only on the Renaissance coming to play, but on the pilot wave, understanding that the reference wave, which had come for them, was that of Sir Isaac Newton and G.W. Leibniz, the mathematization of language, that one could be able to, Newton called them fluxions, Leibniz, with a better understanding of language, called it calculus. The infinitesimal integral calculus, and at the same time the infinitesimal differential calculus. that one could have differential equations and integral equations. One could find the path integral and compute it mathematically to any degree of specificity required. And the same could be done in spades for differential equations. I will bring next week a standard mathematical resource. It's an index of differential equations and their solutions, and it runs to more than 1,000 pages, and it's actually one of 2 volumes, whereas the integral equation encyclopedia is only 1 volume, and not quite as big even as one of those 2 volumes. So that the differential consciousness in the new reference wave overtook completely the limitations of even what before had been considered an enlightenment. Even what had been considered before a century of genius like the 19th century, that the 20th century, by 1/4 of its development, was seen to have the promise to eclipse the entire heritage of mankind, with an ability to make a Pentecostical, mythic celebration look like a sandbox game. And by the 21st century, it has come to be fulfilled. One can understand now there are pilot wave men and women, persons who have an interstellar grasp of visioning, who are able to look out on a cosmos that nearly 14 billion light years is just the beginnings of what one would consider the home turf. What has not changed is mankind. That the species of Homo sapiens sapiens had a tremendous 40,000 years ago transformation into art, and its concomitant transformation 2,500 years ago into science. Pythagoras was very much a scientist already. Ezekiel could understand scientifically what Moses could not understand scientifically. The Buddha could understand scientifically, etc. The quality that has been elusive is science, because science cannot be understood until one understands history. And history cannot be understood until one understands the prismatic persons, men and women, who generate history, and are able then through that to understand that there are phases of consciousness that are not in a cycle but in an ecology. And one of the great figures at the beginning, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century was Henry Adams. And Henry Adams, who was the son of Lincoln's ambassador to England during the Civil War, Francis Adams. He was the grandson of John Quincy Adams, the 6th president of the United States and a great astronomer, by the way, and the great-grandson of John Adams, who was the 2nd president of the United States. His great classical book is called Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres. And he says especially, Chartres Cathedral is the apex of a time form. It was built in the 1100s AD. And that Chartres, by understanding it, led Henry Adams to the understanding that the physics of matter, solids, liquids, gases, are all phases of phenomenality, that there is such a thing then as phases of history. And wrote just before World War I a devastating revelation that was entitled The Rule of Phase in Human History. And he computed by the physics of phases of phenomenality that civilization was on a running out of energy, of verb. And when he plotted what he knew from Chartres being the apex in the 1100s, going back to the carrier wave, he didn't know it was a carrier wave at that time, didn't use that term, but going back to the birth of Jesus, he computed that civilization would run out of gas in the 21st century quite early on. And that would be it, because there would be no more energy left. This happened about the same time that H.G. Wells was writing every year a great science fiction visionary novel beginning with The Time Machine and ending with When the Sleeper Wakes and The First Men in the Moon. This was all in the first couple of years of the 20th century and the closing years of the 19th. We're going to come back and try to understand the tremendous push in the 1100s that was the trigger for Henry Adams' vision of the rule of phase in history and why it was very, very important for the 20th century to have that right when the structure of the atom was first found by Rutherford and Bohr. Take a break. Let's come back to the way in which the rediscovery of what ostensibly, traditionally is called the past has a different quality when there are more dimensions than just space-time. The phenomenality and the existentiality of space-time limit. They obviate, so that what is contained in space, indexed by time, remains then compartmentalized. The classic case of this was 5,000 years ago in Egypt. Even the very highest quality of the culture at the time, becoming dynastic Egypt about 3000 BC, arranging all of the nomes of Egypt, the northern set and the southern set brought together as one Egypt. Even there, the limitations of existentiality and phenomenality made a day a box. It was understood that one can have a new day, but that new day will be a new box that will be contiguous to the previous box as it was contiguous, and so on and so on, and will be and will be and will be. And that the linearity of this immense expanse is the horizon. It is the true horizon. There is a horizon of the world, as far as we can see, at that extent, that's the horizon of which the sun and the moon and the season of stars can rise or set. And so there is the understanding that this horizon, that the Lord of the horizon, the divinity who has the capacity to be the Lord of the horizon, is just so the Lord of millions of years, which one records day by day. This is an atomization of time that was the deepest impress that has lasted until our own day. And yes, there is a day and its complement the night. And in order to give a balance, a symmetry, a stability, the classic day meant that there is a 12-hour day and a 12-hour night. And that the traveler, the journeyer of this, is the sun going across the sky in the day, setting and going under the world, into the underworld for 12 hours at night. And it's not so much 12 hours as it is coming into confrontation with 12 gates. These are the 12 gates that portion out the underworld and are the underside of the box of the day. And while the sun is going through the 12-gate every night cycle, we have an opportunity, because the sun now is in the underworld journey, to see the stars. And that masculine sun has a deep complement by the feminine stars. And the earliest way in which that was expressed is that the goddess Nut has a body which is star-spangled. And her body arches over the world with the fingertips on one part of the horizon and the toe tips on the other part of the horizon, and she spans with her star-spangled body the celestial joy of the fact that the sun is able to make its journey through the 12 gates successfully every night and rise sure as the sun rising. And if we can join in the wisdom of her star-spangled body, we will join in the courage of his 12-gated underworld passage into rebirth each day, each night. It took a tremendous, stronger than a Herculean insight to expand the visionary field so that one began to understand that there is something else at play here. And in the pyramid texts, and the 64th chapter of the pyramid text, one finds the first trigger indication. About 2,500 BC, about 500 years later, that there is a continuity that had escaped from the box, from the container. Yes, it partook of the sun's courage and of the starry expanse's gloriousness, the feminine gloriousness of the starry world and the tremendous insightful courage of the masculine sun being able to come back and come back and come back for millions of years, day by day. That 64th chapter of what became the Egyptian Book of the Dead is the trigger that someone had understood, that in fact it was Thoth who had understood that one could use a language, a hieroglyphic, a sacred writing of language, and say, I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That the time in which I am real is not contained by space nor time, nor both tuned together, though it has a relationality. My reality is a continuity which is not limited to the containers, not limited to the gates, and in particular, not limited to what the gates present and represent. Each and every time, that is, one comes to the gate, it's the gate to a cavern. And you cannot pass through the gate unless you have the sacred language to be able to respond to the challenge that that gate is going to deliver to you. And only by having the language in its sacred penetration will you be able to go through the gate, but you will then be in that cavern. And the book of the 12 gates, it's also the book of the 12 caverns. And in order to have rebirth, tomorrow morning, dawn, you have to be able to remember what the sacred language is and how to shape its reply, because you will not be able to do it by rote. You will again have to be spontaneously able to remember and to pass not only through that night, but when the rebirth comes in, when the sun comes into play, it has its own radiance that does not efface the stars, but moves among the stars even though you cannot see them now. So you cannot be blinded by the radiance of what senses see, hear, feel, touch, mind conceives. That to mistake that for everything is the beginnings of dissolution. So that you have to remember the invisible, visionary, fifth dimension by day, and you have to remember the poetic, sacred language by night. And in this way, you are able not only to have the masculine navigate the 12 gates and the 12 caverns, but to still remember that one is doing this under the arch of the feminine starry wisdom. And so wisdom was always feminine. Not just for this reason, though one can say that, but in this way. And to rediscover when one had forgotten this is the rediscovery of remembering. Because where it was forgotten was in a faulty, limited memory. Remembering does not forget. That's why it's remembering. It is always active in the field of vision. Always. It never not is active. And remembering as a dynamic in an infinite field of vision dances with creative imagining. And yes, creative imagining is the freedom sprung from the imagination. Just like remembering is the source of the memory. So while there is such a thing as the mind, as thought, having a structure to understand containers and squares and circles and triangles and so forth, that memory and that imagination are vehicle enhancers for the structure of symbolic thought, but they must be free to look through a transparent symbolism to get back to creative imagining, the art, and remembering, which is the history, so that the vision can leap into the science of the cosmos. This freedom was found by William Shakespeare when he was 28 years old. He'd gone through a series of years of being a teacher in the Lancastrian houses in the Midlands of England. He had come to London as a young man, and his first job was taking care of the horses of riders that would come out to the edge of the smaller London and go to plays, and he got to know the family that owned the theater and loved the actors and loved the productions, the costumes, and was reading and reading and reading to get himself up to Renaissance speed. And one of his favorite writers was Ovid. And in Ovid, one finds the art of love. In several books of Ovid, who then brings into play the conscious visioning of love as the way in which the creative imagining and the remembering. Remember that Newt and the sun are not limited to the sun and the moon. That the moon, yes, is feminine, but that the earth also is feminine. The journeyer, if you're just looking at the sun, is masculine, but has to remember that the masculinity is in play and a feminine wisdom at the same time that it's reaching the challenges of remembering the sacred language, the poetic, by which one can continue and rise again, have a dawn. So that the sunset is the renewal each time of participation in a continuum, that the Lord of the horizon now is not the Lord of millions of years, but of infinity. The present is not a moment that splits the past and the future. It is a dip of the oar. In the Odyssey, Homer has Penelope tell Odysseus, after he has come back and won his kingdom, won his palace, won her again, he cannot cement this until he tethers it to an action which is necessary for those men who live by the power of dipping the oars, to take an oar and to go inland in Greece, from Ithaca to the mainland and north, until he comes upon a people who do not know what an oar is. They've never seen water bigger than the streams and something around them. And there to sacrifice, thanks for the homecoming, to Athena, like Nut, who guided him through the incredible Odyssey. Not just to find one's day of homecoming, which was taken away from all others, all other men, because they could not remember. They could not creatively imagine. But Odysseus, in having his day of homecoming, even though he had it, could not make it real until he was able to rejoin himself to the life of being with the feminine, of being with Penelope. And her name is always perfectly balanced. Penelope. It's like a tilde with two P's. Penelope, who then knows in her feminine wisdom that though he went away when he was 20 years old, when their son Telemachus was just a babe, just barely able to walk, he was gone for 20 years. He was gone for half his life, and he was gone to kill on a massive vengeance scale. He went to Troy under the pressure of Agamemnon, making sure that Helen could not be stolen from his brother Menelaus by Paris of Troy. And not just to kill him, but to efface Troy from the face of the earth and kill all of the Trojans, men, women, and children. And that this overweening masculine viciousness was the obfuscation, was the intent to make an oblique blip out of life and love and capacity. And that he had fallen into an unknown trance of murderous vengeance. And being very good at it, especially good. He had the same attitude of his homecoming. That he was going to make his way regardless, relentlessly, willful. Because kings of that ilk, that order, do that. Whereas to recover as Athena's gray-eyed horizon, which is the infinite horizon of the real, she says again and again to him, do not lie to me. I know very well who you are. It's for you to remember who you are and who you are talking to and who you will be talking to, because Penelope has my eyes. She can see the horizon of the real. And you must be able to live with that horizon of the real, or you will not have her, or your homecoming, or yourself. When he wrote his first great play, which is A Midsummer Night's Dream, the central homecoming was one of the actors in a play within the play named Bottom, who, because he messes around with being careless about being real, is turned into a donkey, turned into an ass. He made an ass out of himself. And in order for the king of the fairies to serve notice that he is really the power, he makes it kind of like a quality where his queen, Titania, is going to be put under a spell. He doesn't do it because he doesn't know how to do it, but he knows that he has someone on his staff, in fact, named Robin Goodfellow in the mythologies, in the fairy tales, but named Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And when he sprinkles the juice of a very, very potent charm, drug, herb on her sleeping eyelids, she will fall in love with the first person that she hears their voice. And when she awakens at night in the forest, she hears poor Bottom, now become an ass, braying and trying to sing the song that he's supposed to have in the play within the play, and she falls in love with the braying of this ass. And the ridiculousness of the whole scene is the play within the play within the play in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that at the very end of the play, first produced in 1592, Will was just barely 28 years old. The last scene, everybody else goes to bed, goes to sleep. All the marriages take place that were problematic throughout the play, and they're alone in front of the evening campfire, midsummer's campfire near St. John's Day, which is just a couple of days after the solstice, the 23rd of June. The epilogue is spoken by Puck directly to the audience. And for 400 years he has said, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended. That you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long. Else the pick a liar call. So, good night unto you all. Give me your hands if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends." He doesn't leave the stage, he vanishes. That's what the first quarto, published in 1600, emphasizes. He doesn't leave, he vanishes. This quality of the donkey comes from Apuleius. Apuleius, who loved Ovid's great love works, but also loved his masterwork was called the Metamorphoses. And he wrote his own Metamorphoses that translates as the Golden Ass, because the protagonist is a man who turns into an ass, turns into a donkey, and goes through all kinds of convolutions. And only after 10 books of being an ass of a man is he restored back because of Isis, who restores him back to being a human, back to being a better human, because he can still have all the remembering as he was as an ass. And the asinine world in which he was seen and considered thus and so and no more, now he is able to see, as the cover of the latest reprinting of the Penguin Classic of Apuleius, the Golden Ass. In the previous edition, some 20-some years before, they truncated it so that one didn't see Isis. And they blurred the top so that one did not see that Hermes not only has the caduceus of Hermes, but in the other hand, he has the kind of sistrum instrument that Isis has. The metal sistrum has 3 bars, and it has little ringing capacities, but when it's shook, it makes a light cacophony which scatters the abilities for language, for diction, for speaking, for attention, or anything to have. It's a confusion-making wand for those who can be mazed. If you can be mazed, you don't know how to be free, to be amazed. You don't have any access to vision. The caduceus is the way in which one understands. The night stars, her star emblazoned body that has the cycles of the moon, is not only the cycles of the moon fitting into the starry expanse, but the moon also exists going into the day, and one can still see phases of the moon during the day. And there is such a thing as a midsummer or a midwinter moonrise and sunrise, a moonset or a moon rise, a sunset or a sunrise, that they can be equidistant from the horizon. And every Vajrayana tanka, when it's being real, really real, will have those two together in the corners, in the angles of the way in which one does not only look up and out, but looks real, for real. When we come next week, we'll be able to take Apuleius and Ovid and put them back into the 1100s, back into that time period from 1100 to 1199, and understand that in there were incredible events that brought the heroic fierceness of an Iliad into the challenge of an Odyssey, and delivered the consecration that there is some special thing called romance. And what in 1135 in Geoffrey of Monmouth was the manly Arthur adventures held by the magician Merlin to come into play like a serious puck, there is such a thing as a Midsummer Night's Dream that one can go through and come back into the realization about love in its romance of being able to energize through the horizon that used to be a limitation of divinity and now is but the way in which one can index the highs and lows of an energy called thrice greatest time waves. More next week.